Part 1. Brittany Collips. Brittany Collips did not look like a threat. She looked like reassurance. Young, energetic, approachable, she carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had already lived several lives. A former military service member. A high school teacher. A wife. A mother of 3. In a suburban Texas community, she represented exactly what parents hoped for when they handed their children over to a school each morning. Stability. Discipline. Care. Inside the classroom, Brittany's presence softened the edges of authority. Students described her as warm, patient, and easy to talk to. She listened. She remembered small details. She made the space feel human rather than institutional. To administrators, she was dependable. To parents, she was safe. To students, she felt different from the others, closer, more understanding. Her personal life appeared equally grounded. A family. A home. A routine. There were no public warning signs. No visible chaos. Nothing that suggested the boundaries of her role were beginning to blur. From the outside, everything aligned with the image of a teacher who had earned trust the hard way and maintained it carefully. The shift did not arrive loudly. There was no sudden scandal. No dramatic incident that set off alarms. What happened unfolded quietly, in fragments, behind closed doors. Conversations that lingered longer than they should. Familiarity that felt harmless at first. Private communication that moved away from professional topics. Each step small enough to be rationalized in isolation. The students involved were legally adults, all over the age required by law to be considered grown. That fact became central later, but in the beginning it served as a mental shield. A justification. A way to convince oneself that no real harm was being done. Yet they were still students. Still enrolled in her school. Still under her authority. The relationships multiplied. Not one. Not two. Several students, overlapping in time. Encounters took place away from campus, often at her home when her family was absent. The secrecy was not accidental. It was structural. Privacy became protection. Silence became routine. Inside the school, rumors began to circulate. Whispers between students. Stories that felt exaggerated until they did not. The kind of talk adults often dismiss as gossip. But the digital trail did not lie. Messages. Images. Conversations stored on phones. When school administrators were alerted, the situation escalated quickly. Law enforcement stepped in. Investigators spoke to the students involved. Accounts matched. Timelines overlapped. Digital evidence supported what had been rumored. The case no longer lived in the realm of speculation. It was documented. Concrete. Unavoidable. For the community, the revelation felt like betrayal layered on disbelief. This was not a teacher who fit a familiar stereotype of misconduct. She was not isolated. Not visibly unstable. She had a family. A history of service. A record of responsibility. That contrast made the case harder to process. Under Texas law, the central argument was never about age. The statute was clear. A teacher is prohibited from engaging in intimate relationships with students enrolled in their school, regardless of whether those students are legally adults. The law recognizes an inherent imbalance of power that cannot be erased by a birthday. The defense focused on consent. The students were willing. No force was involved. No coercion, at least not in the narrowest legal sense. But the prosecution framed the issue differently. This was not about mutual desire. It was about misuse of authority. About a professional boundary designed to protect students from influence they may not fully understand in the moment. The courtroom became a space where two interpretations of responsibility collided. On one side, the idea that adulthood automatically equals autonomy. On the other, the understanding that power dynamics can override formal definitions of choice. The jury was asked to decide not whether something was allowed, but whether it was acceptable within the role Brittany held. Testimony from the students painted a picture of how quickly lines dissolved once they were crossed. What began as admiration turned into something more confusing. The teacher they trusted became someone whose approval carried emotional weight. That shift changed the nature of every interaction that followed. When the verdict was delivered, it was unequivocal. Brittany Collips was found guilty on 16 counts related to improper relationships with students. The sentence that followed was 5 years in prison. Some viewed it as too lenient given the number of charges. Others saw it as severe considering the ages involved. The debate reflected a deeper discomfort with how society categorizes harm when traditional markers do not apply. She served approximately half of her sentence before being released. Afterward, she retreated from public life. No interviews. No attempts at explanation. The story remained, even as she disappeared from view. In Texas, her name became shorthand for a legal principle many had never considered before the case. The fallout extended beyond one individual. Parents questioned how such behavior could unfold without detection. Schools re-examined policies. Conversations emerged about boundaries that had previously been assumed rather than enforced. The case forced a reckoning with how trust is granted and how easily it can be misplaced. Psychologically, the question lingered. How does someone with structure, family, and responsibility convince themselves that repeated boundary violations are harmless? Power combined with familiarity can create a dangerous illusion. The belief that closeness equals consent. That approval equals permission. That no one is being hurt if everyone appears willing. But authority changes context. It alters perception. It shapes decisions in ways that are invisible until consequences arrive. Brittany Collips did not act in chaos. She acted within a system that trusted her, and that trust became the very thing that allowed the damage to occur. Some stories are disturbing because of their violence. Others because of their subtlety. This one unsettles because it shows how easily lines can fade when no one is looking, and how ordinary a fall from trust can appear until it is complete. As you reflect on this case, consider where responsibility truly begins and whether legality is always the same as innocence. In the next part, the story grows darker, involving a teacher, a child, and a relationship that would challenge the very meaning of accountability. Part 2, Mary Kay Letourneau. Mary Kay Letourneau came from a world built on structure and expectation. Raised in a large Catholic family with political influence, she was taught discipline, morality, and public responsibility from an early age. Her father was a state legislator. Appearances mattered. Reputation mattered. Right and wrong were supposed to be clear. She followed the expected path. University. Marriage. Children. A career in education. By adulthood, she was a wife and a mother of 4, living in the Seattle area, working as an elementary school teacher. Parents trusted her instinctively. She taught young children, the age group most closely associated with innocence and protection. In the classroom, she was seen as nurturing and attentive. Few questioned her intentions. Behind that image, her personal life was deteriorating. Her marriage was unstable. Accusations of infidelity and emotional distance created a private environment filled with resentment and loneliness. The public role of devoted teacher and mother existed alongside a private sense of dissatisfaction that continued to grow. In that fragile emotional state, she encountered one of her students, a boy who was 12 years old. At first, the interaction appeared ordinary. Extra attention. Encouragement. Support framed as mentorship. No alarms sounded. The behavior fit comfortably within the language of care. Gradually, the dynamic changed. The attention became exclusive. Boundaries blurred. Authority shifted from guidance to control. What was once framed as concern turned into dependency. The child began to occupy an emotional role that no student should ever fill. The imbalance of power was total, even if it was disguised as affection. The relationship did not remain hidden for long. When Mary Kay became pregnant, the reality could no longer be concealed. Law enforcement intervened. The case shocked the nation. A teacher. A child. A pregnancy. The contrast between her public image and the facts was jarring. She was arrested and charged under Washington law. Yet the initial legal response was unexpectedly lenient. A plea agreement reduced the potential prison sentence dramatically. She received a short jail term and mandatory treatment. Central to the agreement was a strict order prohibiting any contact with the child. The message seemed clear. The court had drawn a line. But Mary Kay ignored it. Soon after her release, she violated the no-contact order. Authorities discovered her with the boy again. At the time, she was pregnant for a second time, once more carrying his child. The decision to continue the relationship was not impulsive. It was defiant. It suggested a belief that consequences did not fully apply to her. The violation changed everything. The original plea deal was revoked. This time, the system responded forcefully. She was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. While incarcerated, she gave birth again. The image of a former elementary school teacher raising children born from a relationship with her former student became one of the most unsettling symbols of the case. She served her sentence in full. When she was released, many assumed the story would finally end. It did not. After her release, she reunited publicly with the former student, now an adult. They insisted their relationship was genuine. They described it as love. They rejected the language of harm. Soon after, they married in a ceremony covered extensively by the media. Cameras captured smiles, vows, and celebration, while the public reacted with disbelief and anger. For some observers, the marriage complicated the narrative. They argued that time had transformed the relationship into something consensual. Others rejected that idea entirely, insisting that a relationship rooted in exploitation could never be separated from its origin. The debate was fierce and deeply polarized. The media played a central role. Talk shows, documentaries, and interviews revisited the case repeatedly. Mary Kay was sometimes portrayed as troubled, sometimes as romantic, sometimes as manipulative. Public sympathy fluctuated depending on framing. Critics pointed out that if the roles had been reversed, the tone of coverage might have been far less forgiving. Her original family suffered quietly in the background. Her children from her marriage grew up under the shadow of scandal. Their lives were altered permanently by choices they did not make. The long-term impact extended far beyond the individuals at the center of the story. Years passed. The couple lived together, raising their children. Public interest faded, then returned in waves. To many, the relationship remained impossible to reconcile with basic principles of protection and responsibility. To others, it represented a troubling example of how society struggles to define harm when time passes and narratives shift. Eventually, the relationship deteriorated. Separation followed. Health problems emerged. Mary Kay Letourneau died of cancer years later, surrounded by her children. Her death closed the legal chapter but not the ethical one. Her story remains one of the most disturbing cases in American education history, not because of graphic details, but because of the questions it refuses to settle. Where does care end and exploitation begin? Can harm be undone by time? Does persistence transform wrongdoing into legitimacy, or does it merely normalize it? The case exposed deep discomfort in how society views authority, gender, and accountability. It challenged the belief that intent matters more than impact. It forced the public to confront the reality that affection does not erase imbalance, and that a child cannot consent to a relationship shaped entirely by adult power. Mary Kay Letourneau did not fit into simple categories. She was not a stranger. She was not an outsider. She was a teacher, a mother, a trusted adult. That is what made the case so haunting. It demonstrated that danger does not always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it arrives wearing the language of care. Her name continues to evoke unease because it represents a moral fault line that many would rather avoid examining. A story where legality, emotion, and responsibility collided and left no clean resolution. This case often leaves viewers divided, and it is worth considering where your own line falls when trust, authority, and intent collide. In the next part, the pattern repeats with a different face, revealing how second chances can be offered, ignored, and ultimately destroyed. Part 3, Pamela Rogers Turner. Pamela Rogers Turner was not invisible. She stood out. A physical education teacher in Tennessee, energetic, loud in the way coaches often are, confident with her body and her voice. Students liked her. She encouraged participation, pushed kids to move, to compete, to feel strong. Parents saw an active teacher who connected easily with young people. Colleagues saw someone committed to school life and athletics. She was married to a local coach, part of the same ecosystem of trust that surrounded school sports. Rumors began where they often do, in places adults rarely monitor closely. Locker rooms. Gym corridors. Casual conversations between students who were not supposed to notice patterns, but did. A tone that lingered too long. Attention that felt selective. Familiarity that crossed from coaching into something harder to explain. At first, it sounded like exaggeration. Teenagers talk. Stories grow. No one wanted to believe that a well-known teacher was slipping into dangerous territory. The situation escalated when a student, 13 years old, became the focus of concern. What initially appeared as favoritism turned into something more serious once messages surfaced. Digital communication erased the safety of distance. Texts, images, exchanges that did not belong between an adult educator and a child. Investigators moved in quickly once the evidence became clear. This was no misunderstanding. It was documented behavior. Pamela was arrested and charged with multiple counts related to misuse of authority and inappropriate conduct. The community reacted with shock. For many, the idea that a physical education teacher could cross such a line felt especially disturbing. Sports often create intense bonds. Trust is physical as well as emotional. That trust had been broken. The court sentenced her to 8 years in prison. It sounded definitive. A clear consequence. But the reality unfolded differently. She served less than a year before being released on probation. Strict conditions were imposed. No contact with the student. No access to minors. Monitoring designed to prevent repetition. It was a second chance, whether framed that way or not. She did not take it. Within a short period of time, Pamela violated the terms of her probation. Authorities discovered that she had resumed contact with the same student. This was not accidental. It was deliberate. The decision suggested that the initial punishment had not created distance, but defiance. She was arrested again, and once more faced the court. Despite this warning, despite public scrutiny, despite legal consequences, the pattern continued. A second violation followed. This time, the evidence was even more damaging. Additional digital records confirmed ongoing contact. The court no longer saw someone who had made a single catastrophic mistake. It saw someone unwilling or unable to stop. The response was swift and far less forgiving. Her probation was revoked. An additional prison sentence was imposed. Pamela returned to incarceration, this time for several years. The message was clear. Opportunities for leniency had been exhausted. During this period, everything else collapsed. Her teaching career was over. Her marriage ended. The community that once embraced her distanced itself completely. She was no longer discussed as a coach or mentor, but as a cautionary example. A person who had been given multiple chances and had discarded each one. What made the case linger in public memory was not just the original offense, but the refusal to disengage. Many cases of teacher misconduct fade after sentencing. Pamela Rogers Turner remained in headlines because each violation reopened the wound. Each return to court reinforced the perception that consequences alone were not enough to change behavior. Media coverage framed her story as one of repetition. A cycle that continued despite escalating punishment. Commentators questioned how someone could risk everything again after already losing so much. Others focused on the systems that allowed early release. The debate shifted from individual guilt to institutional responsibility. When she was finally released years later, she emerged into a life stripped of its former identity. No classroom. No gym. No authority. Her name remained searchable. Her past followed her. Rehabilitation, if possible, would have to happen in silence. Psychologically, the case raised unsettling questions. What drives someone to continue crossing a boundary even when the cost becomes unbearable? Is it denial? Obsession? A distorted sense of connection? Or a deeper inability to accept limits once power has been exercised? Pamela's story suggests that for some individuals, the loss of control is not experienced as a warning, but as a challenge. Each restriction becomes something to push against. Each consequence becomes proof that the system is wrong rather than the behavior. That mindset turns second chances into fuel rather than correction. For the victim, the impact was lasting. Adolescence interrupted by legal proceedings, media attention, and the knowledge that the adult involved did not step away even when ordered to do so. That kind of persistence changes the nature of harm. It transforms a single violation into a prolonged intrusion. Communities often ask how such situations can be prevented. Pamela Rogers Turner forces a different question. What happens when prevention fails repeatedly? When warnings are issued and ignored? When intervention occurs and does not end the behavior? Her case became a reference point in discussions about probation enforcement and repeat offenses. It illustrated that early leniency can sometimes send the wrong signal. That accountability delayed is not always accountability softened, but accountability weakened. There is no redemption arc here. No clean turning point. Only a sequence of decisions that narrowed her future step by step. Each choice closed another door until none were left open. Pamela Rogers Turner is remembered not for a single act, but for the inability to stop. For choosing continuation over compliance. For turning opportunity into evidence against herself. Her story leaves an uncomfortable silence behind. A reminder that boundaries exist not only to be drawn, but to be respected, and that some people reveal who they are not in their first mistake, but in what they do after being told to stop. Many viewers find themselves divided over whether early leniency was compassion or a critical error, and that tension often sparks intense reflection. The next part introduces a case where public image, appearance, and justice collide in a way that reshaped national debate. Part 4, Deborah LaFave. Deborah LaFave entered the public eye already framed by contradiction. Young, conventionally attractive, recently married to a police officer, she appeared to embody a version of stability that felt reassuring to parents and administrators. She taught at a middle school in Florida, working with students who were still forming their sense of boundaries and trust. Her classroom image was approachable, friendly, and modern, far removed from the stereotype of a distant authority figure. When allegations emerged involving a student who was 14 years old, the reaction was immediate and explosive. The idea that someone who looked like her, lived the life she lived, and stood beside a law enforcement spouse could be accused of such behavior collided violently with public expectations. Shock quickly turned into outrage. The investigation moved forward with clear testimony and supporting evidence. The focus should have been on the nature of the misconduct and the vulnerability of the student involved. Instead, something else began to dominate the conversation. Her appearance. Headlines described her youth before her actions. Photographs circulated endlessly. Television panels discussed her looks in tones that bordered on fascination. This shift altered the narrative. While the core facts remained unchanged, public discourse drifted. The seriousness of the offense competed with commentary about whether she seemed dangerous at all. Some voices minimized the harm, framing the situation as a lapse in judgment rather than a profound breach of responsibility. Others pushed back forcefully, insisting that the attention given to her image revealed a deep flaw in how society evaluates wrongdoing. The courtroom became a stage not only for legal arguments, but for cultural bias. Prosecutors prepared for what many assumed would be a prison sentence. The charges carried significant weight under Florida law. Yet the resolution stunned observers across the country. Deborah LaFave accepted a plea agreement that resulted in house arrest rather than prison time, followed by probation. The justification offered centered on sparing the student the trauma of testifying in a full trial. From a legal perspective, it was framed as a pragmatic decision. From a public perspective, it felt like a betrayal of principle. The backlash was immediate and intense. Parents, educators, and commentators expressed disbelief. Many questioned whether such an outcome would have been possible if the teacher had been male, older, or less conventionally attractive. The sentence became a symbol, not just of one case, but of a perceived double standard. Debate intensified across media platforms. Some argued that punishment should be tailored to individual circumstances. Others countered that consistency is the foundation of justice. The idea that appearance could soften consequences struck a nerve. The case became shorthand for a larger fear, that public sympathy could be manipulated by aesthetics rather than facts. As time passed, Deborah LaFave struggled to comply fully with the conditions imposed on her. A later incident involving inappropriate contact violated the terms of her probation. Authorities responded by revoking the agreement. She served a short jail sentence, a delayed consequence that reignited discussion rather than resolving it. By then, her teaching career was over. Her marriage had collapsed. The life she once presented as secure and respectable no longer existed. Yet even in downfall, the narrative surrounding her remained fragmented. To some, she was an example of leniency gone too far. To others, she was proof of how media distortion can warp both perception and punishment. Nationally, the case settled into law school discussions, opinion columns, and documentaries. It was cited whenever questions of gender bias arose in cases involving authority figures. Advocates for equal sentencing pointed to it as evidence that the system could be swayed by factors unrelated to harm. Critics of sensational media argued that the obsession with her appearance trivialized the experience of the student involved. What made the case endure was not just the outcome, but the discomfort it exposed. Society wants justice to feel neutral. This story suggested that neutrality is fragile. That who a person is perceived to be can matter as much as what they have done. Deborah Lefebvre largely withdrew from public view after her release. There were no attempts to reclaim the spotlight. No public defense tours. Her name, however, continued to circulate whenever conversations returned to fairness in sentencing. She became a reference point rather than a participant. The ethical tension remains unresolved. Should compassion for victims justify lighter sentences? Can sparing testimony outweigh the need for deterrence? Does equal justice require identical outcomes, or identical standards? These questions linger because the case never offered a satisfying answer. Her story illustrates how easily attention can drift away from responsibility when narrative framing changes. The danger was not only the misconduct itself, but the way it was discussed. When focus shifts from actions to appearances, accountability weakens. Deborah Lefebvre did not become infamous solely because of what happened in a classroom. She became infamous because of what happened afterward. A legal resolution that many felt failed to match the gravity of the breach. A media environment that blurred the line between reporting and fascination. A public left uncertain whether justice had truly been served. In the end, she stands as a symbol rather than a singular case. A reminder that justice does not operate in a vacuum, and that perception can influence outcomes in ways that leave lasting scars on public trust. This part often leaves viewers questioning whether fairness was compromised or compassion was misapplied, a tension that continues to divide opinion long after the headlines faded. In the next part, the pattern continues with a case that escalates from controversy into repeated defiance, pushing the limits of second chances even further. Part 5, Brienne Altus. Brienne Altus was known for presence. Stylish, articulate, confident without appearing rigid. A high school English teacher in Utah who spoke the language of her students, referenced their culture, and rejected the distance that older models of authority relied on. In her classroom, discussion felt open. Students felt seen. Parents heard that she inspired teenagers who otherwise struggled to connect with school. That image became her shield. Modern teaching often celebrates closeness, relatability, and emotional intelligence. Brienne fit that ideal perfectly. She blurred the line between mentor and peer just enough to feel progressive rather than reckless. Administrators praised engagement. Students praised understanding. No one wanted to interrupt what appeared to be success. Rumors did not begin as accusations. They began as discomfort. Comments that felt too personal. Messages that extended beyond school hours. A tension that lingered with certain students longer than others. At first, these details were easy to dismiss. Teenagers misinterpret. Teachers communicate digitally. Boundaries evolve with time. But the rumors did not disappear. They multiplied. Eventually, 3 students came forward. Their accounts overlapped in ways that could not be explained away. Each described a gradual shift from academic support to personal focus. Each described communication that moved away from curriculum and toward emotional dependency. Investigators listened. Digital records confirmed patterns. This was not a single lapse. It was repeated behavior. Utah law treats relationships between teachers and students with particular severity. Authority itself is the issue. Consent is not the defense it might appear to be elsewhere. Once charges were filed, the potential consequences were immense. Multiple felony counts carried the possibility of decades behind bars. The school district acted quickly. Leave became termination. Admiration turned to disbelief. Parents questioned how warning signs had gone unnoticed. Students struggled to reconcile the teacher they trusted with the allegations now attached to her name. While awaiting trial, Brienne was released under strict conditions. No contact with students. No digital communication that violated court orders. These restrictions existed to protect the process and prevent further harm. She ignored them. Authorities discovered that she had remained in contact with at least one student despite the explicit prohibition. The decision altered the tone of the case. What had been framed as blurred judgment now looked like refusal to accept limits. Additional charges followed. Public sympathy eroded rapidly. Faced with overwhelming evidence and escalating consequences, Brienne accepted a plea agreement. She admitted guilt to several counts. In exchange, the state reduced the number of charges. The sentence that followed reflected Utah's indeterminate system. A term ranging from 2 years to 3 decades. The exact length would depend on parole board decisions rather than a fixed calendar. The ambiguity unsettled the public. Some viewed the sentence as appropriately severe. Others focused on its flexibility, worrying that it allowed for early release. The debate revealed a deeper tension. Was punishment meant to isolate, or to rehabilitate? Brienne entered prison with her identity erased. No classroom. No students. No professional future. Years passed quietly until her case resurfaced in parole hearings. She expressed remorse. She acknowledged harm. She spoke of accountability and change. After serving just over 4 years, she was granted parole. The reaction was immediate and divided. For some, early release signaled faith in rehabilitation. For others, it felt like a failure of deterrence. Parents asked whether justice had been served. Former students asked whether damage could be measured in time served at all. The community struggled to process the outcome. Schools reviewed policies. Conversations intensified about digital communication, mentorship, and oversight. The case became a reference point in training sessions and parent meetings. A warning wrapped in familiarity. Brienne attempted to rebuild her life away from public attention. She avoided interviews. She disappeared from social platforms. Yet the record remained. The sentence might have ended, but the label did not. Her story forces an uncomfortable reflection. When does inspiration become influence? When does closeness become control? Modern education encourages emotional connection, but that connection carries risk when authority remains unacknowledged. The line between punishment and rehabilitation remains contested. Some believe early release undermines trust. Others argue that change cannot occur without opportunity. Brienne Altus exists in that unresolved space. Neither fully condemned nor fully redeemed. What makes her case linger is not spectacle, but relatability. She did not appear dangerous. She appeared familiar. That familiarity allowed boundaries to fade slowly, almost invisibly, until they were gone. The collapse of a so-called inspiring teacher reminds us that intent does not override impact. That harm can occur even when framed as care. That authority does not vanish simply because it is exercised gently. As this chapter closes, many viewers find themselves questioning where accountability should truly end and forgiveness begin. The next part moves into a case where faith, discipline, and justice collide inside a religious institution, raising the stakes even higher. Part 6, Catherine Ronk. Catherine Ronk worked inside an environment built on faith, discipline, and moral certainty. A Catholic high school in Michigan where parents believed values were reinforced as strongly as academics. Sending a child there meant more than education. It meant trust placed not only in teachers, but in the institution itself. Ronk was a Spanish teacher in her early 30s. Educated, articulate, enthusiastic about her subject. Students described her as engaging and supportive. Parents saw a professional who fit comfortably within a religious setting. There was little reason for suspicion. In a school shaped by tradition and belief, the assumption of safety ran deep. That assumption collapsed when allegations emerged involving a student who was 15 years old. The relationship violated both legal boundaries and the moral framework the school claimed to represent. The sense of betrayal was immediate and intense. This was not just a failure of one individual. It felt like a rupture inside a system built on trust. Authorities moved quickly. The investigation did not drag on for years. Evidence was gathered. Statements were taken. The imbalance of power was clear. The law left little room for ambiguity. A teacher and a minor student inside the same institution crossed a line that could not be defended. Catherine Ronk chose to plead guilty. There was no prolonged attempt to contest the facts. No effort to reframe the relationship as misunderstood. The admission of guilt shifted focus from whether the misconduct occurred to how the justice system would respond. The sentencing hearing drew national attention. In many similar cases, outcomes had varied widely. Some resulted in probation. Others in short sentences. Observers waited to see whether this case would follow a familiar pattern or break from it. The judge did not hesitate. During sentencing, the court addressed an issue that had lingered in public debate for years. Gender. Specifically, whether female teachers received more lenient treatment than male counterparts in cases involving abuse of authority. The judge stated plainly that gender would not influence the outcome. The law applied equally. The harm was the same regardless of who committed it. That statement resonated far beyond the courtroom. Catherine Ronk was sentenced to a prison term ranging from 6 to 15 years. The range reflected Michigan's sentencing structure, but the message was unmistakable. This was not symbolic punishment. It was substantial incarceration. For many observers, it marked a turning point. Reactions were mixed but intense. Some praised the decision as long overdue. A demonstration that justice could be blind to gender and appearance. Others argued the sentence was too harsh, pointing to her lack of prior criminal history and her willingness to accept responsibility. The divide reflected broader disagreements about punishment and mercy. Within the Catholic school community, the impact was devastating. Parents questioned leadership. Alumni expressed shock. The school faced scrutiny over oversight and safeguards. Trust once assumed had to be rebuilt slowly, if at all. The case left a permanent mark on the institution's identity. For educators nationwide, the sentence sent a clear warning. Authority carries weight whether acknowledged or not. Religious setting does not soften legal boundaries. Moral language does not replace accountability. The expectations placed on teachers are not symbolic. They are enforceable. Catherine Ronk entered prison with her career ended and her reputation erased. There was no return to the classroom. No alternative path within education. Her name became associated not with language instruction, but with a legal precedent many considered necessary. The case continued to surface in discussions about sentencing fairness. Supporters cited it as evidence that courts were correcting imbalances. Critics worried about inconsistency, noting that similar cases elsewhere still resulted in lighter outcomes. The conversation expanded beyond one individual to the structure of justice itself. What made this case distinct was clarity. There was no ambiguity in the judge's reasoning. No attempt to soften the narrative. The ruling stated that trust violated inside a school demands real consequences. That children, regardless of gender, deserve equal protection. That authority abused in silence would be addressed publicly. For the student involved, the legal outcome did not erase harm. No sentence can. But it acknowledged seriousness. It affirmed that the system recognized the breach not as a mistake, but as a crime rooted in power imbalance. Years later, the school continues to operate, but under the shadow of what occurred. Policies changed. Oversight increased. Conversations about boundaries became explicit rather than assumed. The cost of that awareness was high, but unavoidable. Catherine Ronk's story is remembered less for the act itself than for the response it triggered. A moment when the justice system spoke plainly about equality before the law. When a judge addressed a cultural blind spot directly. When punishment aligned with principle rather than perception. This case remains a reference point because it challenges comfortable assumptions. That faith guarantees safety. That remorse guarantees leniency. That gender guarantees sympathy. None of those held. The legal message was unambiguous. Authority does not belong to the individual who holds it. It belongs to the responsibility they are expected to honor. When that responsibility is violated, consequences follow without exception. Many viewers continue to debate whether this sentence represents fairness or severity, and that disagreement reveals how deeply divided public expectations still are. In the next part, the story shifts again, introducing a case defined not by symbolism, but by scale, as multiple students come forward and the fallout grows even wider. Part 7, Nicole Dufo. Nicole Dufo lived a life that blended responsibility and routine. A language arts teacher in New Jersey. A mother of 2 young sons. A familiar face in hallways where parents assumed safety and structure were guaranteed. She balanced lesson plans with childcare, meetings with homework, school calendars with family schedules. Nothing about her public life suggested chaos. The pattern emerged quietly and then all at once. Multiple students. Multiple locations. Repeated behavior that did not depend on a single moment of poor judgment. Investigators later described it as systematic. Not impulsive. Not isolated. A series of actions that followed a recognizable rhythm. Concerns surfaced over time. Not one report, but several. Students spoke about communication that crossed professional lines. Meetings that did not align with school purpose. Familiarity that moved beyond guidance. Each account alone might have been dismissed. Together, they formed a map. Law enforcement began a prolonged investigation. Digital records were collected. Statements were compared. Timelines overlapped. The scope widened. What initially appeared limited expanded into a case involving 6 students. Different settings. Different moments. The same imbalance of power. When Nicole Dufo was arrested, the shock rippled outward. Parents demanded explanations. Administrators faced scrutiny. The school's reputation fractured overnight. A trusted teacher was now at the center of a criminal case defined by repetition. Prosecutors emphasized scale. This was not a lapse. It was a pattern. The charges reflected that view. Each count added weight. Each additional student deepened the sense of betrayal. The law treated the conduct as an abuse of authority that endangered children under institutional care. As the case moved toward trial, a decision altered its course. Nicole chose to plead guilty to selected charges. The plea spared the students from testifying publicly. It avoided prolonged exposure. It also confirmed responsibility. There would be no denial of what had occurred. The sentence that followed was severe. 15 years in state prison, with parole eligibility only after most of that time was served. For many observers, the length stood out. Compared to other cases involving educators, it felt heavy. For prosecutors, it was proportional to harm and repetition. Debate followed immediately. Some argued that the punishment was necessary to reflect the number of victims. Others questioned whether the sentence went beyond deterrence into excess. The discussion revealed a persistent tension in how society evaluates authority-based offenses. For the school community, the damage was irreversible. Trust collapsed. Parents questioned oversight. Students reevaluated memories that once felt safe. Teachers felt the weight of suspicion that follows high-profile cases. Policies changed. Training intensified. The cost of prevention rose after failure. Nicole's children became silent victims of the outcome. Their lives altered by the absence of a parent. Their names tied indirectly to a case they did not choose. The impact extended beyond the classroom and into a family that would now grow up in fragments. Inside prison, Nicole's identity narrowed. Teacher became inmate. Mother became a distant presence. The world she had known vanished. Rehabilitation programs replaced classrooms. Time became the dominant measure. Her case became a reference point in legal discussions. Not because of novelty, but because of accumulation. 6 students. Multiple settings. A duration that suggested intention rather than error. Commentators returned to a central conclusion. This was not a momentary lapse. The phrase, mistake, failed to apply. Mistakes do not repeat across people and places. Patterns do. Systems do. The law responded accordingly. Years later, the school continues to operate under revised safeguards. The memory remains. Names change. Buildings stay. Trust rebuilds slowly, never fully restored. The lesson lingers in policy manuals and quiet conversations. Nicole Dufo's story resists simplification. It is not a tale of temptation or weakness. It is a case study in how authority can be misused repeatedly when unchecked. It underscores why institutions exist to protect those with less power, not to assume safety by default. The sentence did not end debate. It intensified it. Questions about proportionality, prevention, and accountability continue to surface whenever similar cases arise. Her name returns as a marker of scale rather than spectacle. For the students involved, closure does not arrive neatly. Time passes. Life continues. The memory remains part of their story, shaped by decisions made when they had little control. This chapter challenges viewers to consider whether repeated harm should be judged differently from isolated wrongdoing, and where responsibility truly lies when trust is abused over time. The next part moves into a case where youth, marriage, and punishment collide with unprecedented severity, reshaping expectations of sentencing altogether. Part 8, Brittany Zamora. Brittany Zamora was young, newly married, and at the beginning of what looked like a stable career. A sixth-grade teacher in Arizona, she worked with children who were just crossing the threshold between childhood and adolescence. Parents trusted her with daily routines, classroom structure, and emotional guidance. Colleagues saw a motivated educator building a future. Nothing about her life suggested it was about to collapse publicly and completely. The conduct did not happen in distant or hidden places. It occurred within the school environment itself. In spaces meant for learning, supervision, and safety. That detail alone would later weigh heavily in court. The classroom, a place designed to protect children, became the setting of a serious breach of responsibility. Concerns first surfaced quietly. Parents noticed changes. School officials received reports that could not be ignored. Once authorities became involved, the investigation accelerated rapidly. Digital evidence played a central role. Messages and records confirmed behavior that crossed clear boundaries. The facts were no longer ambiguous. Prosecutors filed numerous charges. The volume reflected the seriousness of the conduct and the setting in which it occurred. Each charge reinforced the same conclusion. This was an abuse of authority carried out where oversight was assumed to be strongest. The case moved quickly into the national spotlight. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Brittany Zamora chose to accept a plea agreement. The decision avoided a lengthy trial and spared further exposure for the child involved. It also meant accepting the full weight of responsibility. There would be no dispute over facts. Only consequences. The sentence stunned observers across the country. 20 years in prison with no possibility of early release. No parole. No reduction. A fixed term that would consume most of her adult life. For many, it was one of the harshest punishments ever imposed on a female teacher in a case of this kind. The courtroom emphasized deterrence. The judge spoke about protection, about the need to send a message that authority within schools carries absolute responsibility. The sentence was designed not only to punish, but to establish a boundary that could not be questioned. Media coverage exploded. National outlets debated the outcome. Some framed the sentence as necessary and overdue. Others questioned whether it was excessive compared to similar cases. The discussion often returned to a single phrase. Was this punishment too harsh? Supporters of the sentence argued that severity was the point. That children deserve uncompromising protection. That teaching is not a privilege to be treated lightly. That when misconduct occurs inside a classroom, consequences must be unmistakable. Critics focused on comparison. They cited cases with lighter outcomes. They questioned consistency. They asked whether public outrage had influenced judgment. The debate revealed discomfort with absolute sentences in a system accustomed to negotiation. While arguments unfolded on screens and pages, Brittany's personal life disintegrated. Her marriage ended. Her teaching license was permanently revoked. The identity she had built disappeared overnight. The future she expected ceased to exist. Her family faced public scrutiny they did not choose. Silence became their only defense. Distance their only option. The ripple effects extended far beyond the courtroom, touching relatives who would carry the weight of association for years. Inside prison, the reality of the sentence settled in. Time was no longer flexible. There would be no early release based on behavior. No gradual return. Each year would be served in full. The certainty of confinement reshaped every expectation. Legally, the case became a reference point. Prosecutors cited it. Defense attorneys discussed it. Judges acknowledged it. The sentence marked a shift. A signal that certain boundaries, once crossed, would be met with fixed consequences regardless of age, gender, or background. For educators, the message was unmistakable. Closeness does not negate authority. Familiarity does not erase responsibility. The classroom is not neutral ground. It amplifies power, and misuse of that power invites maximum response. For parents, the case reinforced vigilance. Trust could no longer be assumed simply because a teacher appeared caring or committed. Oversight became a priority. Questions once considered uncomfortable became necessary. Brittany Zamora's story is not remembered for ambiguity. It is remembered for finality. A sentence without flexibility. A punishment without exception. A life divided cleanly into before and after. Whether history judges the outcome as justice or severity remains contested. What is clear is that the case established a new benchmark. One that future courts would be measured against. One that reshaped expectations around accountability in education. The law spoke with clarity. Authority within schools is absolute in its obligation. When violated, the response will be equally absolute. This chapter often leaves viewers weighing protection against proportionality, and that balance remains deeply personal for many. In the next part, the scale grows even larger, as accolades, trust, and a shocking number of victims collide in a case that redefined betrayal at the highest level. Part 9, Jacqueline M.A. Jacqueline Ma stood at the peak of professional admiration. An elementary school teacher in California, praised for creativity, dedication, and emotional intelligence. Parents requested her class. Colleagues pointed to her as an example. Administrators celebrated her success. She was named Teacher of the Year, an honor meant to represent the highest standard of trust and care. That recognition became the most unsettling part of what followed. Behind the awards and public praise, a hidden reality existed. Jacqueline Ma was cultivating inappropriate relationships with children under her supervision, students between 11 and 12 years old. These were not teenagers navigating adolescence. These were children still forming their sense of safety, authority, and trust. The contrast between her public image and private actions was extreme. The case came to light through information that could not be ignored. Investigators uncovered serious physical and digital evidence that confirmed long-term misconduct. The material was not ambiguous. It documented planning, secrecy, and repeated violations. This was not a misunderstanding or a single lapse. It was sustained behavior carried out behind the shield of professional respect. When Jacqueline Ma was arrested, the shock was immediate and widespread. The community struggled to process how someone so openly celebrated could be capable of such actions. Parents felt betrayed not only by an individual, but by a system that had elevated her. The story moved quickly from local concern to national attention. Prosecutors described a pattern of manipulation rooted in authority. The position of teacher was not incidental. It was central. Access, trust, and routine provided opportunity. The very qualities that earned her awards were used to avoid suspicion. Jacqueline chose to plead guilty. The decision spared children from testifying in open court. It also confirmed the full scope of responsibility. There would be no argument over facts. Only judgment. The sentence reflected the severity of the crimes. A prison term ranging from 3 decades to life. For many observers, it was one of the harshest punishments ever imposed on an educator in the state. The judge emphasized protection over rehabilitation. The ruling made clear that certain violations permanently forfeit the right to return to society. The reaction was intense but focused. There was little debate over guilt. The discussion centered on how such a situation had been allowed to develop. How awards and positive evaluations failed to reveal warning signs. How admiration became camouflage. The education system faced hard questions. Background checks, performance reviews, and professional accolades were no longer seen as safeguards. Training programs were reevaluated. Oversight procedures tightened. The case exposed the danger of equating excellence with safety. For the victims and their families, the sentence did not bring closure. Time in prison cannot erase harm. Childhood experiences shaped by betrayal do not reset. Healing became a separate journey, one that extended far beyond the courtroom. Jacqueline Ma's identity dissolved completely. Teacher became inmate. Role model became warning. Awards were stripped. Licenses revoked. The public image she once relied on vanished, replaced by a permanent record of betrayal. Her story remains haunting because it challenges assumptions. That recognition equals reliability. That success equals integrity. That visible kindness equals harmlessness. The case demonstrated how easily appearances can deceive when systems rely too heavily on reputation. There was no partial collapse here. No opportunity for return. The fall was absolute. From the highest praise to the most severe condemnation. From celebrated educator to a sentence that would likely outlast her life. This case is remembered not for complexity, but for contrast. The sharp line between who Jacqueline Ma appeared to be and what she was doing in secret. It forces a reconsideration of how society defines trust and how easily that trust can be misused. The pain left behind does not fade with headlines. It lives in families, in policy changes, in the quiet caution that follows every future interaction between adults and children in schools. The lesson is not subtle. Image is not evidence. Awards are not protection. Authority without accountability creates space for harm. Many viewers find themselves questioning how often admiration blinds oversight and whether excellence can ever be assumed to equal safety. The final part moves into a case defined by scale and duration, where silence lasted for years and the consequences reached further than anyone expected. Part 10, Alyssa McCammon. Alyssa McCammon was not new to the classroom. She had spent years inside the same school system in Tennessee, long enough to become familiar, predictable, trusted. She was a mother herself. A teacher parents recognized by name. Someone whose presence no longer raised questions because time had normalized it. Longevity became proof of safety. The silence around her lasted for years. There were no immediate alarms. No sudden investigation. No early intervention. Whatever discomfort existed stayed buried, misunderstood, or ignored. Students moved on. Families assumed normalcy. The system continued to function as if nothing was wrong. The first report arrived late. Far later than anyone would have believed possible. When authorities finally received information suggesting misconduct, it did not point to a single incident. It opened a door to something far larger. As investigators worked backward, the scale became impossible to ignore. One account led to another. Stories overlapped. Patterns repeated. What emerged was not a case, but a network of harm spanning years. More than 20 potential victims were identified. Ages varied. Circumstances differed. The common thread was authority and access. The revelation stunned law enforcement. This was not opportunistic behavior. It was prolonged. Structured. Sustained by silence. Each unreported moment created space for the next. Each year without intervention deepened the damage. The case took an even darker turn when it became known that Alyssa had given birth to a child connected to one of the students. The reality shattered any remaining illusion that this was abstract misconduct. The consequences were tangible. Permanent. A living reminder of boundaries erased beyond repair. Prosecutors filed a sweeping set of charges. The volume reflected the number of victims and the duration of the behavior. The legal system treated the case with urgency and severity. This was not a matter of interpretation. The evidence was overwhelming. Alyssa McCammon chose to plead guilty. The plea spared victims from reliving experiences in open court. It also confirmed the full scope of responsibility. There would be no minimizing. No reframing. No negotiation over facts. The sentence was decisive. 25 years in prison without the possibility of early release. No parole. No reduction. A fixed term that acknowledged the magnitude of harm and the failure of earlier silence. The courtroom was heavy with consequence. Families of victims absorbed the finality of the ruling. There was no relief, only recognition. Justice could respond, but it could not restore what had been taken. The community fractured under the weight of the revelation. A small town unaccustomed to national attention found itself exposed. Schools were questioned. Administrators scrutinized. Parents replayed years of trust in their minds, searching for missed signs. National coverage followed quickly. The case reignited debates about oversight, reporting mechanisms, and the danger of assuming safety through familiarity. Discussions about gender bias shifted tone. The sentence left little room for claims of leniency. Some commentators focused on prevention. How could this continue for so long without interruption? Others focused on accountability. Why systems designed to protect children failed repeatedly? The answers were uncomfortable and incomplete. For Alyssa's own family, the collapse was total. A life once defined by routine and trust became defined by incarceration. Relationships ended. Silence replaced explanation. Association itself became painful. The victims carried consequences that extended far beyond the legal process. Childhoods interrupted. Trust damaged. Identity reshaped by experiences they did not choose. Healing, if possible, would take time unmeasured by court calendars. This case did not leave space for ambiguity. It was not a misunderstanding. It was not a mistake repeated once. It was a prolonged abuse of authority sustained by inaction and disbelief. The sentence established a boundary that could not be misunderstood. Longevity does not equal safety. Familiarity does not equal innocence. Silence does not equal consent. When authority is misused at scale, the response must reflect that scale. Alyssa McCammon's name became synonymous with the cost of delayed intervention. A reminder that harm grows when it is allowed to remain unseen. That systems fail not only through action, but through inaction. The wounds left behind cannot be measured in years served. They exist in families, in schools, in the quiet vigilance that replaces assumed trust. The damage does not end with a verdict. This final chapter forces a hard reckoning. Not only about individuals, but about environments that allow silence to persist. It asks whether protection can ever rely on appearances alone, or whether vigilance must replace comfort. Some viewers may find themselves questioning how many warning signs were missed and whether earlier voices could have changed everything. If you think this story raises issues that go beyond one person, the conversation does not have to end here.